This is Didan Kamathi with this week's edition of Freedom Now. We'll put on hiatus, on hold, the African drumbeat historical calendar for this week due to three very important topics. We'll commence with analysis of the recent elections in Syria by Johnny Achi from Arab Americans for Syria. Mr. Achi has just returned from over 1 month in Syria as part of a global delegation of Syrians in the diaspora. These patriotic Syrians who not only voted but also organizing to maintain the present democratic secular government of Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'athist Party, which won over 84% of the popular vote. Why? Ethnic minorities, various Islamic sects, women, Christians are guaranteed, based on over 40 years of Ba'athist Party rule, full equality as opposed to the U.S. and NATO de facto backing of the sectarian jihadist terrorists. Yeah, next we'll have our brother Johnny Achi to give us an update on the crisis in Syria, as we have done for the past 3 years, under the Pan-Africanist, Black liberation principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. In addition, we, the people who are darker than blue, have the right and responsibility to have an independent foreign policy, distinct from the 1% Euro-capitalists and their subservient conservative and progressive media, including Pacifica and other so-called progressive media who supports the overthrow of the Ba'athist Party of Bashar al-Assad. Next, Johnny Achi.
Only 2 generations away from the world's most despicable slavery trade. Pioneered so many ways to degrade a human being that it can't be changed to this day. Legacy so ingrained in the way that we think we no longer need change to be slaves.
Okay, it's been about, 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks since we last had you on. I've done some clips from RT and some other interviews to keep our audience abreast of Syria. But you just returned from Syria, and can you give us an update on what's going on in Syria? I know that there was an 84% victory for the Ba'athist Party and President Bashar al-Assad in a multi-party elections, which has been rejected by the West. So can you give us an update on the attitude and the sentiment of the people and what impact this rejection by the West has on the people of Syria?
Absolutely, Didan. First of all, the reason we went to Syria, a delegation, a big Syrian-American delegation, because they denied us the right to vote here in our embassy, the Syrian embassy in Washington. As they closed it just a month before the election, so that many countries and many of the Syrian embassies were either closed or the Syrian nationalists were denied, to go down and vote at their respective embassies in these countries. So there was thousands of Syrians from all over the world who decided, okay, you can close our embassies, but you're not going to shut our mouth. We are going to Syria and to exercise our constitutional right to choose our own, man that we see fit for the next phase. So the message was clear that we're going there to choose who we want to put in this office. The images that we saw there, Didan, are I can't really explain to you. Millions of people came out. And what the West has said that this is false, unofficial, cannot be counted. The country is torn by war. Even in Homs, the city that was supposed to be the capital of that revolutionary, so-called revolutionary, over 890,000 people came out and voted. Even in the old quarter of Homs, who had just been freed by these terrorist groups, thousands of people. There was a polling place there, and thousands of people came out and voted. What I would like to say, I think the message by the Syrians, and you cannot ignore the images, the message was clear. The U.S. NATO has lost this covert war on Syria. After they waged, if you remember 3 months ago, desperate last battle in the city of Kasab, which they terrorized this mostly Armenian Syrian community when thousands of jihadists entered from Turkey. I think Kasab just last week was freed by the Syrian army and its citizens have returned, just like Ma'lula was freed eventually, of course not before the terrorists ransacked it and burned the historical churches and monasteries, but also Qusayr was freed, the Abrud was freed, Kalamon Mountains were freed, Homs completely was freed, and God willing soon Aleppo will be freed. So this covert war, I repeat, the U.S. NATO proxy war on Syria, which is nothing more than an attempt for regime change, has failed. Mr. Assad is there to stay. The election of June 3rd has concreted that fact. Now, talking about the election, one more thing I need to say. Even though it was not the most attractive presidential election in the world by any stretch of the imagination, there were serious challenges. And the two candidates that were, against the incumbent Bashar al-Assad were not relatively very well known. Yet they were courageous enough, they were secular, they had great platforms, and if they were given enough time, I think they would have presented a good challenge. So it was the first step toward, the first move toward true democracy in Syria. And instead of the West taking this first step and embracing it, they fought it. They called to boycott the election. And what we've seen prior to June 3rd, there was on May 28th, that's the day where all Syrian expatriates can go vote in the embassies, and that's what we talked about, that they were closed. And the few embassies that they allowed the voting in some countries, thousands of people came out. They flocked to the embassies. In one case, hundreds of thousands in the case of Beirut. And this scene will never be forgotten anytime soon. And May 28th in Beirut and Lebanon, where the West tells you all these people who have taken refuge in Lebanon, they're against the regime. All these people have run away from the regime. So after the expatriates and the West-backed opposition have boycotted this election, and IS went as far as saying anyone who will vote will be hanged, will be killed, will be head cut off. This is the jihadist part in the eastern. Hundreds of thousands came out in Lebanon. The images are amazing. You will not believe a sea of people that covered the whole Beirut capital. The whole, even the Syrian embassy, because we went to the Syrian embassy 2 days later. I was talking to ambassadors. He was shocked. He was expecting 50,000 people. He didn't believe hundreds of thousands of people. Why are they coming out? They're coming out to tell the world that you cannot tell us who we want to be represented. We are not opposition. We are running away from Syria because there's a war. We're not running from Bashar al-Assad or the Syrian army. On the contrary, we were running from the jihadists, this people that you are supporting and sending weapons to. So I think the message was clear in this election. The Syrian people chose they chose security, they chose stability, they chose peace against terrorism. And that's what we need to honor and respect. And no one can ever tell us again that you are the minority and the majorities are opposition. This election showed that the majority of the Syrian people, even in the countries that people took refuge, supposedly running away from the government, they were 90% in support of Bashar al-Assad, 90% of support of the Syrian army against this fascist terrorist groups like Jihad, like Al-Nusra and ISIS.
Let me ask you, Johnny, it's kind of sad that for us to talk about peace in Syria or peace in Iraq, we really have to address the question of the United States in particular, as well as NATO, who are not Syrians or not Arabs, but that's the reality of world politics today. Given the fact that the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Levant, has been basically moved out of or ran out of Syria, where they were defeated basically in terms of their attempt to overthrow the government, have now invaded Iraq and are having great victories in Iraq, given the fact that the United States trained Iraqi forces don't seem ideologically or politically committed to fighting these terrorists. What is the prospect for the United States and NATO developing a political relationship with the present government of Syria, which obviously has been successful in defeating or stopping the terrorist Islamic State of Syria, Iraq and Syria, from victory in Syria? In other words, as there's been discussion of the Democratic Party Obama administration now negotiating with Iran, will the same thing occur with Syria?
That would have been a good scenario, but yet this is what is amiss, Didan. With all due respect, let's just not forget the United States who created Al-Qaeda. The United States government who created ISIS. We can talk about this for as long as you want. We know what happened in Iraq. The mainstream media will tell you that Washington is sad, is concerned about what's happening in Iraq. But let's see the facts. How did the civil war start? It did not start until after the U.S. invaded Iraq, dismantled Iraq, sent 500,000 Iraqi soldiers home. They dismantled the Iraqi army, one of the strongest in the area. They told them, go home. You're dismantled. There was no more army. And Iraq since then had no army. Okay? Then they ignited the militia. Let's build militias here, the Kurdistan, the Shia, the Sunnis. The United States government have had every part in this conflict in Iraq. The civil war did not happen. prior to the United States invasion of 2003, and prior to even the previous war on Iraq, the fundamentalists were non-existent in Iraq. Iraq did not have any fundamentalists. It was a secular country living in peace, just like Syria was just prior to this. So the mainstream media will tell you that the United States is concerned. What is the United States going to do? The United States is going to use this as a pretext to bomb Iraq and eventually bomb Syria, something that Obama could not achieve last August when he wanted to bomb Syria, and it's still bothering him, okay? The supporting of influx of terrorist brigades in Iraq is an act of foreign aggression, and that's what the United States has done. And let me ask the question, why the United States is currently concerned about ISIS in Iraq? And I've been coming on your show, we've been talking about ISIS for at least the last year, and prior to that year, the Nusra, and prior to that year, other jihadists. Mm-hmm. They've invaded Syria. They've been killing and beheading people in Syria, beheading priests in Syria, burning churches in Syria. We've talked about it repeatedly, and the United States government ignored it. On the contrary, they continue to support these what they call moderate rebels, and we all know, and evidence are there, even by a senator from Virginia who said all the military weapons, all this man-made, the anti-tank rocket they invaded Qasab with, the United States sent supposedly to the moderate rebels. Somehow they ended in Nusra's hands, and they always end up in ISIS hands. So the arming of and fueling these fights between the different sects in Syria is a NATO-made war. So now, is the U.S. going to get involved? Yes. President Barack Obama said it Thursday that the U.S. will send for right now about 300 experts, and then we will probably use drones and bombing in certain area. And when they were asked, would you mean that means would you go further into eastern Syria? They said yes. No land. We have fighting the war against terrorism, and if it means we have to bomb parts of Syria, we will. What I'm worried about, Didan, is that the United States has inflated this little monster. They give birth to this little monster. Call it Al-Qaeda, call it ISIS, call it Nusra. And then it grew big enough for them to use it as a pretext to go in and invade them. And yes, they will not last a chance with the United States. However, the United States is going to use this as, corridors for the human, it's a pretext to intervention. Part of northern Iraq, part of eastern Syria, and they will make it as no-fly zone like they did in the past, like they did in Iraq for 10 years before they invaded. So I'm worried and I'm afraid that, our war on terror should not start by just bombing and invading. It should start from the bottom, from stop sending military and start igniting stop igniting sectarian, divide amongst people.
What are the prospects for Syria remaining a united country, given the fact that the eastern region now is supposedly in the hands of ISIS? Didan, it's been for almost a year and a half in the hands of ISIS. And yes, the Raqqa is one province. It's completely in their hands. The Raqqa is not a very strategical, it's in the desert pretty much. It's a flat area bordering Iraq. It's completely in their hands. And I don't think the Syrian government does not have the power to take it back. I think there is more important provinces like Aleppo, which is bordered by Turkey and has 4 million people live in it, and Homs, Damascus, Daraa. There are more important strategic towns. However, it's a good example for the world to watch what is the substitute or what is the challenges that the U.S. want to replace Syria with. You have a secular regime who have the full support of its nation today. Even I can tell you, some people who were on the opposition, and I was shocked to see hundreds of thousands in Beirut. I really thought the majority were maybe, doesn't want to take side of this, doesn't want to take side of this war. But they come out and they stood hours long for 2 days, and some of them did not get a chance to vote with their families and children. That showed that the majority of the Syrian people want this government. So they are supporting the Syrian army. The Raqqa is left alone because maybe let's see what ISIS, how they're ruling. Women cannot come out of the house today. Worse than Saudi Arabia. Anybody who does anything, if you smoke cigarette, your hand is cut, your head is cut if you don't belong to their ideology. So the Syrian government will eventually take back this region. But what's most important is the Syrian army right now is moving, is covering up the whole inside of Syria.
What's left is Aleppo, Raqqa, and Daraa, so just bordering little territories. The situation is much better today. I spent 3-4 weeks, and previous month I went there for another 2-3 weeks. The situation is a lot better. People have kind of learned to live with it. We do get the rockets, propelled grenades falling on Damascus every now and then, every day, about 15 or 20 from the rebels. Random shelling of civilian areas. This is one thing I can understand how the world is still not condemning. Every single day, these are not fighting another army. They're not fighting security forces. They're shelling civilian neighborhoods. Every day, 15, 20 rockets. Thank God those homemade rockets, they don't have that, explosive powers, but we do have, casualties every day. But aside from that, Damascus is living a very normal life. You were there not so long ago, maybe last year. You've seen millions of people going to school, going to work, living, moving on. They're saying, we want to continue our lives. We don't want this fascist, U.S.-backed, puppets to be replaced. We want to choose our own future. And this is how it's going. And I think Raqqa eventually will be back and Syria will remain united. And that's the reason they moved into Iraq, because they failed to divide and conquer Syria. They failed to oust the current regime. They failed to weaken the Syrian army. On the contrary, after 3 years of the conflict, we see Syria is stronger than it will become. Of course, we have a lot of rebuilding to do, but it will become stronger than we've ever been.
Johnny, the rhetoric of the Democratic Party and Barack Obama, as well as the State Department, talks about supporting the secular opposition or moderate opposition. What is the status of the so-called moderate opposition in Syria today?
There is modern opposition, but don't tell me modern armed opposition. This is what I don't expect. I can't agree to it. There is modern opposition, plenty. And before that, the U.S. had vetoed these figures. The Syrian government has been wanting to speak with them, have been speaking with them. However, at that moment, the U.S. had its own, what they call moderate opposition outside of Syria. We've seen it happen in Afghanistan. We've seen it, they've tried to do it in Iraq. They bring a puppet that is well-bred. He's going to be kneeling to the, to the U.S. and NATO demands. Now, the inside of Syria, Iran, and especially after this election, we've seen those two people that went against the Syrian president, they did get a lot of votes. One got 300,000 votes. The other one got 550,000 votes. So there is a fresh air, a new opposition in Syria. And the Syrian government is dealing with them on a most civilized way. They're allowing it to start parties. They want them to grow. We want a free, pure multi-party election. However, the moderate that the United States speak about, what they call moderate rebels, we continue to say there is no moderate rebels. If you carry weapons against your own government and you kill people, you are not moderate by any dictionary. If in the United States we start some forces are started and they call themselves the Free American Army, just like the Free Syrian Army, and they start carrying weapons and burn government buildings and attack police stations, guess what's going to happen? Mm-hmm. The United States government is going to crush them. The army is going to come in and just dismantle them. They will not be considered moderate. There is nothing moderate about going against your own country, about betraying your country, carrying weapons against your country and your army. The Syrian army is made out of all Syrians from all sects, from all cities. So you're killing a representative of your own country. That's not moderate. The United States government, just like it was able to divide this country, if they want, they can put people together and help them make peace instead of help them fight. The United States has a lot of pull. They can tell these people, drop your weapons and go sit down with this government. You've achieved a lot. There's a lot of reforms on the table. Take it, make use of it. If they didn't boycott this election, I tell you last year, if they had a true candidate, maybe he had a chance. But instead, you cannot choose the weapon to divide and conquer. The United States government wants either their own puppet, the one that they choose for us, or they would rather see Syria continue to go through the mess it's going through. But there is a strong, moderate opposition, not blessed by the United States government, but by the Syrian people. And hopefully, Syria is going on its way to be a multi-party, plural, democratic country.
Well, we'd like to thank you, Johnny Achi. I think it's very important for us to stand on the principle of the right of the people of Syria to self-determination, and also, more importantly, too, the fact that U.S. dollars should be used for construction within the context of the United States as opposed to destruction in